Imagine standing in a crowded square surrounded by neighbors, merchants, and strangers with the air thick from the smell of smoke and sweat. The murmur of voices is restless, curious, frightened. A wooden platform rises at the center, and on top of it rests an enormous cauldron filled with water and iron hooks suspending it over roaring flames. The crowd knows what is coming. They have gathered not for a sermon or a festival, but for something far darker. The man standing at the edge of the platform trembles, his face pale as the soldiers grip his arms tighter. He is a cook by trade and a condemned criminal by judgment. Today he is not simply going to die, he is going to be boiled alive. The words themselves sting the imagination, yet in past centuries this was not a whispered horror story or a legend, it was reality. A punishment sanctioned by kings and executed before the eyes of a public that demanded both justice and spectacle. In an age when the line between deterrence and cruelty blurred, the fate of this cook served as both a warning and a form of entertainment. The echoes of his screams would carry across the square, carried by the wind and etched into memory as a reminder of the cruelty of human invention. You may wonder how such an unbearable act could have been allowed. Who decided that plunging a living person into boiling water was justice? And what crime could possibly deserve such an end? The story of the cook who was boiled alive is not just about the brutality of medieval law. It is a mirror into the darkest depths of history, a reminder of how societies once sought control through terror and pain. But behind every punishment, there is a story, a crime, a motive, and a decision made by those in power. To understand how a man could end up facing death in a cauldron of boiling water, we must step back into the world that created such punishments. A world where fear and authority ruled above compassion, where pain was not hidden behind prison walls but displayed openly for the masses to watch and remember. And in this tale, the cook stands not only as a criminal, but as a symbol of how easily humanity can justify cruelty in the name of order. To understand why boiling alive was ever considered a form of justice, we must first step into the Europe of the 15th and 16th centuries. These were years when kingdoms were fragile and rebellions common. Rulers feared betrayal, not only from foreign enemies, but from their own citizens. To keep order, they believed punishments had to terrify the public more than crimes tempted them. Execution was rarely about removing the guilty alone. It was about sending a message. The message needed to echo across towns and villages, ensuring that no one dared repeat the offense. Public squares became theaters and punishments became performances. The crowd was both witness and participant, their gasps and shouts adding weight to the lesson the rulers intended to teach. Among the various punishments of the time, hanging, beheading, burning, and breaking on the wheel, boiling alive stood out as one of the rarest and most horrifying. It was not used for all crimes. Instead, it was reserved for what were considered the most treacherous betrayals, acts that poisoned trust at its root. In England under King Henry VIII, the act of poisoning was deemed so sinister, so cowardly and destructive, that he declared boiling alive as the appropriate punishment for anyone found guilty. The reasoning was brutal but simple. Poison struck invisibly. It crept into meals and drinks. It killed not with the clash of swords, but with deceit and slow torment. To the rulers, poisoning was an invisible form of treason and deserved an equally terrifying response. Thus, when a cook was accused of slipping poison into food and causing deaths, the punishment was chosen not only for him, but as an unforgettable warning for every servant, tavern worker, and kitchen hand across the kingdom. In a time when food and drink were the lifeblood of trust within households and courts, the thought of being poisoned at your own table haunted nobles and peasants alike. The cook who betrayed that sacred trust by turning meals into weapons embodied the deepest fear of betrayal. No one could eat without wondering if their next bite might bring death. And so the law sought to answer fear with fear by turning the punishment into a spectacle that would linger in memory far longer than the crime itself. The square, where the execution was to take place, would already be filled hours before the event. Families brought their children not out of cruelty, but because it was part of communal life. People saw executions as lessons just as much as justice. The condemned was paraded through streets dragged under the watchful eye of soldiers, sometimes beaten, sometimes mocked, until finally reaching the platform. The massive cauldron suspended over flames stood ready, its water bubbling, hissing steam rising like a ghost over the crowd. This was not merely death. It was theater, a grim ritual designed to both terrify and satisfy. To the rulers it showed authority. To the crowd it offered both horror and reassurance. Horror in witnessing human suffering. Reassurance in believing that justice, however cruel, had been done. The cook accused of poisoning knew his fate the moment the sentence was spoken. There was no hope of reprieve, no chance of mercy, for poisoning was seen as the ultimate betrayal, and mercy was reserved for crimes less sinister. He was led through the streets, his head lowered, chains clattering with each step. The crowd followed, some jeering, some praying, others silent with dread. When he reached the square, the sight before him was enough to drain the blood from his face. The cauldron was already filled, water bubbling as the flames licked its iron sides. The heat radiated outward, pressing against the skin of those standing nearest. The soldiers bound his hands and tore away his outer garments, leaving him in thin clothes that would offer no shield against the boiling liquid. The proclamation was read aloud. The crime, the sentence, the justice about to be carried out. The words were formal, yet their meaning was simple. The man before them was guilty, and his punishment was to die by being boiled alive. The crowd quieted, leaning forward with a mixture of horror and fascination. The cook struggled, his body shook with terror, but the soldiers were unyielding. The first moments were, perhaps, the most chilling. He was lowered slowly by chains and iron hooks into the cauldron, not all at once but gradually, limb by limb. His screams tore through the square, echoing against the stone walls. Mothers covered their children's eyes, yet many peeked through fingers, unable to look away. The water hissed as flesh touched its surface, steam rising thick around his body. Eyewitnesses of similar executions wrote of the skin blistering almost instantly, of the body convulsing violently, as boiling water seared nerve and muscle. The man howled, thrashing against his restraints, his voice rising into a pitch that seemed inhuman. The crowd recoiled, some gasping, some shouting for the punishment to end. Yet the ritual demanded completion. The executioners ensured the descent was slow, prolonging agony, ensuring the crowd saw every moment. Minutes felt like hours. The smell of boiling flesh mingled with smoke, a stench that turned stomachs and yet burned itself into memory. The man's screams weakened, turning to ragged cries, then gurgles as steam choked his throat. His body sank deeper into the cauldron until only his face remained above the water, contorted in pain, eyes wild with terror. The soldiers held firm, watching as life drained from him before finally letting the body sink beneath the surface. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that weighs heavier than sound. The bubbling of the cauldron was the only noise left, a grotesque reminder that justice, according to the law, had been served. The crowd dispersed slowly, some whispering in shock, others shaking their heads. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers muttered prayers. The image of the cook's suffering would haunt them for years. A vision, too cruel to forget. For those who witnessed the boiling, it was not simply the death of a man. It was the confrontation with the darkest side of justice. To see someone burned, blistered, and broken alive was to see humanity stripped of compassion. People who entered the square with curiosity left with nightmares. Imagine the child standing on tiptoe, clinging to a parent's arm, watching the cook's face twist in agony. That child would never forget the sound of screaming or the smell of boiling flesh. Imagine the young woman who covered her mouth in horror but could not look away, carrying the memory for decades, whispering it in hushed tones to her children and grandchildren. These moments were not easily buried. They became part of local folklore, carried in voices and shadows. Yet rulers saw this impact as proof of success. The fear in people's eyes was the very tool they relied on to maintain control. When the king decreed boiling as punishment, he did not seek compassion. He sought order through terror, and in that goal, he succeeded. The people were terrified. The memory of boiling alive deterred countless others who might have considered poison as a weapon. But at what cost? Fear keeps order, but it also corrodes trust. The act of boiling alive showed people that cruelty could be dressed as justice. It revealed how easily human beings could not only invent instruments of torture, but also justify them. It taught the crowd to associate justice not with fairness, but with spectacle, with pain, with horror. The cook's death echoed beyond the square, beyond the reign of a single king. It became a story whispered across generations, a tale of cruelty that defined an era. Even centuries later, historians look back at the practice not with admiration but with horror, for it shows us what humanity is capable of when fear outweighs mercy. The story of the cook boiled alive is not only about a single man or a single crime, it is about the choices societies make. When fear is their guide, it reveals how the thirst for order and control can lead rulers to embrace cruelty as justice. It shows how ordinary people can become spectators to suffering, standing in silence or even cheering as life is torn away. It is easy to look back and think we are different now. Yet the story reminds us to remain vigilant against cruelty in all its forms. The line between justice and vengeance is thin, and once crossed, it can lead to horrors as unimaginable as boiling a man alive. If history teaches anything, it is that fear cannot be the foundation of justice. Compassion must be. The cook's screams may have faded centuries ago, but his story remains a mirror held up to our humanity. Do we use power to terrify, or to protect? Do we treat life as sacred or expendable? These are questions that echo across time, so as we leave behind the smoke and steam of that square, let us carry the lesson, not the spectacle. The past was cruel, but the future depends on our choices. May we choose empathy over fear, mercy over cruelty. Thank you for walking through this dark corner of history with me. If you found this story haunting and thought-provoking, do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more untold stories of the past.